So welcome everybody to this edition of Edgy Ideas podcast. Edgy Ideas is proudly sponsored by the Eco Leadership Institute. We offer coach and leadership training courses, and we have a vibrant community of practice where international members join once a month for a webinar. Our focus is on co-creating the good society. To find out more, go to www.ecoleadershipinstitute.org, and to read my polemic blogs and essays, go to Simon Western at Substack. Thank you for listening. Today, my very special guest is Karim Safieddine. Karim is a PhD researcher in sociology at the University of Pittsburgh, and he specializes in the study of social movements in Lebanon. His research examines how these movements challenge or reinforce prevailing power structures and ideological norms. Beyond academia, Karim is an active leftist organizer in Lebanon. He holds an MSc in comparative politics from the London School of Economics and a BA in economics from the American University of Beirut. His research interests include political sociology, social movements, historical sociology, and intellectual history. Karim, you're very welcome to Edgy Ideas podcast. How are you today?
Good. I'm good. As good as we can be, given everything that's happening in the world, and particularly in the very crazed place I come from. But all is well. I'm really, really happy to be on this podcast and to engage in this conversation. I know across the world, people are constantly talking about how they can change it and how they can challenge people who are enormously and infinitely more powerful. Smarter people will just stay home. But we will do the other far stupider but more interesting and more entrepreneurial way of living our lives. So that's fine with that.
That's good. Well, we're pleased to have you here. I mean, just to let the audience know, we contacted each other. Karim contacted me. I think it's about a paper I wrote called Autonomous Leadership, and he was interested in some of my thinking. And then he sent me one of his papers on the political worker, and I'm like, wow, this Karim, I need to talk to him, and let's get him on a podcast. Let's hear what he's got to say because he's very interested. And Lebanon. I mean, let's start with Lebanon. Do you want to say something about Lebanon because it's like at the heart of so much at the moment?
Maybe I can, look at Lebanon from my own trajectory, because I think that's where Lebanon becomes interesting. It's how Lebanon manifests in every person that grows in Lebanon and how that intersects with the global sphere. I mean, I come from a Shia Muslim family from South Lebanon, right? And South
Yeah.
Lebanon was occupied by Israel for a very long, long time. And that means that when you're born within this sphere, you're introduced to conceptions of national liberation and resistance, and conceptions of going against an occupier, and really rethinking your role in the world as someone who is, pursuing a struggle of subservience, right? And of course, things then progress, because I was quite young when I got introduced to politics, as I was looking at the Israeli aggression in the Gaza Strip in 2014. And from there, I began, I got introduced to conceptions of left wing politics, anarchism, global history, etc., etc. And Beirut, where I was raised, has been the center of all of these contradictions, right? Beirut had a very strong progressive movement. It had a civil war. There was the Palestine Liberation Organization, which also was part and parcel of both the errors of the civil war and the very interesting cultural transformations. So that's where I come from. And you also had this division about what is Lebanon, right?
Mm.
Where you had certain sects that had a particular understanding of how Lebanon to be formed, and other sects who had a different understanding. You had the people that wanted Lebanon to be part of the Arab world, and you had others that wanted Lebanon to play a minor role related to itself. Right? Is Lebanon a gateway for Palestinian liberation, or is Lebanon a country on its own? I think that's the contradiction every single Lebanese feels, particularly when they're part of, the story of their own community, really. And I also grew in the context of the rise of the anti-establishment movement in Lebanon, which was telling people, listen, let's stop talking about our identity and start talking about reform. Let's start talking about social revolution, not national revolution, right? And I think that's what
Let
a
me
lot
just
of
stop you
people,
there. Let me just
yeah.
stop you there because that really interests me. So, when are you talking about? Are you talking about Arab Spring politics or?
This is right between the Arab Spring and the 2019 version of the Arab Spring. So this is
Okay.
around 2014,
Hmm.
2015. There was a movement called the You Stink movement, where there were garbage all across the street in Beirut, and people
Yeah.
rose against that in order to advance a vision for a more productive waste management, an effective waste management plan. But in the context of the garbage, people were saying the elites are the garbage. The
Mm.
neoliberal system is the garbage. The sectarian system is the garbage. So people politicized the garbage, right?
Interesting.
That was 2015,
Mm.
and that's what advanced other avenues of movements, electoral or otherwise, in Lebanon. As someone who's getting more accustomed to the organizing scene, as I entered AUB and joined the AUB Secular Club, right? Because remember, I was talking about Lebanon as this clash of sectarian identities that we're trying to redefine Lebanon for what it is. Is it part of the Arab world? Or is it the small Mediterranean country that we want to remain neutral and not do anything about? That sectarian clash is something we wanted to challenge as secularists, as people who wanted to separate sectarian and ethno-tribal identification from the role of the state as a neutral actor. And the AUB Secular Club was my first political organizational home. And that gave rise to a variety of other activities I took part of. And I then went for a PhD to try to understand what was going on with me and my comrades as we were, going through this crazy adventure, as many other social movement organizers at this time and period in the world.
That's so interesting. I mean, so many questions. I mean, you start off by identifying as a Shia Muslim, and then you now identify as a secularist, kind of against tribalism and sectarianism and stuff. Can you say something about that tension between those identities?
It's really interesting because as a Shia Muslim, there is, first of all, a religious identity that is supposedly very rebellious because Shia Muslims were once rebels.
Mm.
They were once the rebels of the first period and epoch of Muslim history, right? That rose against particular rulers in favor of alternative rulers.
Yes.
Um, and Shia are a minority within the Muslim community,
Yeah.
and they were a minority that were relatively persecuted and oppressed.
Hmm.
So there is that element of taking my sectarian identity and giving it a social justice lens, because you have people who
Okay.
do that. You have Shia social justice warriors, right?
Okay.
Um, but then you refute that and you say, no, I want something that is a bit more cosmopolitan, a bit more universalistic. And that's the legacy of Shia leftists in South Lebanon, who
Okay.
were almost, and many of whom were assassinated by Shia theocrats
Mm.
because they rejected that instrumentalization of the Shia identity in favor of a much more cosmopolitan, universalistic understanding of their role in the world. And I think that's the transition. And I think that exists across the world. This is not related just to me. You have people who consider their quest for racial emancipation very identitarian. And you have people
Yeah.
who say, no, this is part of a universal quest for human freedom and humanism and this general understanding. And Edward Said talked about this a lot with the Palestinian question too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that is interesting. You could think about the civil rights movement in the USA and how the Black Christian kind of identity kind of was
Exactly.
part of that wider movement, but it was like using Christianity as a social justice kind of inspiration rather than as a kind of a
Exactly.
theocratic, yeah, movement. Yeah, very interesting. I've always wanted to go to Beirut. I got to visit Syria before the massive conflict, just before it all broke down, and I was in Palestine before the first Intifada. I was wandering around Palestine and up in the Golan Heights and in Nablus and places. I didn't get to the Gaza, but yeah, but I never got to Beirut, and it was never quite the right time because it's been so busy there.
Yeah.
Always something happening. But Beirut was always seen as it was like a diamond in the Middle East. It was like a special place. It was like a commercial place. It was a very diverse place. That it's always been a cosmopolitan kind of energy there as well, hasn't it?
Yes, and Beirut has been a laboratory, in my view,
Mm.
for
Okay.
leftists trying to imagine a cosmopolitan nationalism and a very chauvinistic and tribal Middle East, right?
Yeah.
Because Beirut has Lebanese of different sectarian and ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Beirut has migrant workers in the thousands. Beirut has Syrians in the tens of thousands.
Mm.
Beirut has centers where you have a relatively thriving but also increasingly repressed LGBTQ plus community. Beirut induced feminist movements. Beirut includes Arab dissidents from all across the world. So it's a laboratory for you to make whatever you want out of it. Now the establishment in Lebanon has been decisive about making it a very shitty place. But generally speaking, we have attempted to re-innovate the role
Mm.
of Beirut. I can give one example and then I'll
Do
talk.
so.
When there was this huge attack on Mashru'a Layla, which was a band, kind of like an alternative band in the Arab world that became increasingly more mainstream and popular, but also had, um, uh, musicians that were openly LGBTQ, right? So when they were doing one of their concerts in Lebanon, it was attacked, and so they had to cancel the concert, or the festival that was hosting them had to cancel the concert. Now, that wasn't done in Beirut, it was done towards the north.
Hmm.
What happened is that activists all across Beirut organized an alternative concert in Beirut for that band without bringing them to the concert, but playing their songs by other people who did covers. And that got over 4,000 people.
Wow.
So Beirut, you make out of it what you wish because it's
Mm.
so hard to control it.
Yeah.
So from below, you are free to experiment and potentially get killed in the process.
Yeah. I mean, but what you're sharing with us is will be news to a lot of people. I mean, in the social imaginary of people in the West, you know, they think of Lebanon, they think of war zone, they think of kind of Shia kind of Muslims, they think of kind of conflict, they think of Hezbollah, this is the newsreels kind of churning out the kind of this story. The other story is kind of just not told, so it's great for you to share kind of how much energy there is, how much dynamism, how much thinking is going on, how much kind of intellectual and activism is happening there. It's really really interesting.
This is the legacy of the Civil War. I mean,
Mm.
even if you look at the theocrats, even if you look at the sectarian parties, they have their intellectual exercises. Like if you look at
Yeah,
Hezbollah, right?
yeah, yeah.
Hezbollah is not just this fundamentalist Islamist group. It's a fundamentalist Islamist group, yes, but it's also a product of other things. It's a
Mm.
product of militants trained by Fatah and the PLO, which was a secular organization or a
Yeah.
conservative nationalist organization, right? But not theocratic. You had people who were inspired by Khomeinism, not necessarily from the theocratic perspective, but from a third worldist nationalist perspective,
Mm.
right? The Ali Shariati type. And you had people who were flirting with Baathism in the 50s and 60s, and that got sunk into Hezbollah. You had people
Yeah.
who were leftists who got sunk into Hezbollah. And then you had people that Islamized, right? This
Mm.
this project from a national liberation project to what was called the Islamic Revolution and then reformulated it as the Islamic resistance.
What are you reading at the moment? What are you what kind of informs your thinking at the moment? What intellectual kind of ideas are you working with at the moment, Karim?
So at this stage, and particularly when you become very involved in organizations, you're constantly just obsessing about how organizations build power,
Yeah.
really, and you're just constantly being inspired by different contexts in which they do so. So the idea of the political worker, this conceptualized building block of how people employ their labor to build discursive power, but also eventually some level of organizational sustainability from the element of someone who has nothing but their work, very limited resources, like many people in Lebanon, like many secular organizers in Lebanon, right? That's the obsession today. That's something we're trying to figure out both practically and theoretically, and providing a roadmap for it. But really, this is all inspired by a variety of intellectual trajectories that have made up not only me, but a variety of other leftists in Lebanon and Syria and the Levant more generally. Right? It starts with Arab nationalism and this idea of progressive politics that is,
Mm.
part and parcel of how Lebanon can transform economically and socially. And then it goes into a more libertarian lens of leftism. That's where people start reading more Noam Chomsky and looking at more democratic leftist perceptions.
Yeah.
Really, your piece on autonomous leadership is part and parcel of that because
Mm.
we believe it's part of that epoch in which many people were getting introduced to a more democratic deviation of the left. And that's where you have very important intellectuals in Lebanon, like Fawaz Trabulsi, like Samir Qasir, like Hazem Saghi, uh, leftist liberals, a range between Marxist Democrats and leftist liberals who are attempting to reinvent national liberation and leftism away from its autocratic Baathism, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
legacies of Saddam and Jamal
Mm.
Abdel Nasser and Hafiz al-Assad, really reinventing something that works for a 21st century humanism.
Sure. Sure. Did Edward Said and Frantz Fanon, did they play a part in your thinking, and were they important in Lebanon in the thought process of Lebanon?
Edward Said, yes. Frantz Fanon, very recently.
Okay.
Especially after October 7th, right?
Yeah.
Franz Fanon became a new superstar, an intellectual ancestor for many
Mm.
people who were really trying to conceptualize why violence takes place in colonial contexts.
Yeah.
Edward Said historically has been extremely important within Beirut's elite circles, but increasingly less important within the mainstream sphere. But what's very interesting about these intellectuals is that uh, they re-enter the social
Yeah.
political space via
Yeah.
memory, via videos, via
Mm.
digital archives, via social media. They re-enter the space and they attempt to inspire and intellectualize and rationalize and justify and legitimize certain social political directions in that process. But if I want to look at Edward Said who played a very important role in my understanding of Palestine
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
I was like 15. And then not only Palestine, but also an understanding of imperialism and Orientalism and the
Mm.
other, and then increasingly humanism. Edward Said, I think he's
Mm.
unfairly misinterpreted by his advocates and his antagonists as someone who is very identitarian and
Yeah.
as someone who has reinvented a post-colonial tribalism, where I think he has been so adamant about his humanist character, so adamant and so insistent that he is not talking about an East and West that kind of looks like how people envisioned this new conflict in Israel Palestine. This is just East and West.
Mm.
To him, this is about reinventing a humanist space. But of course, Edward Said himself transformed a lot, right, between the 70s and the early 2000s, and he transformed with the Palestinian cause
Yeah. Yeah.
because you had a belief that the two-state solution was possible. And then in the late 1990s, that slowly retracted. So
Yeah.
Edward Said changed as the potential for Palestinian liberation became increasingly more limited.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think intellectuals are also subservient to their causes and to the conditions of their causes.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I mean, Said was a big influence on me and Fan. I mean, both from kind of helping me with the understanding of how we interject kind of denigration from the other, how you kind of form character kind of from the other, and Said, I think you're right, was very, yeah, he had a hard time. He was given a hard time by a lot of people, but at the heart of his work, you could see this deep humanism kind of informing his work. And he was a thinker. I mean, I love the fact that he was kind of a real thinker. He wasn't trapped in kind of just an ideology. He was able to kind of think when the situation context changed. He kind of thought about kind of what that meant and kind of what that meant deeply to kind of the humanitarian kind of cause. Yeah, so very interesting. And what's it like for you to be in the US at the moment? What's your experience of being a student in the US? Do you go between Lebanon and Philadelphia, Pittsburgh? Sorry.
So yes, so I travel a lot between Pittsburgh and Beirut. In fact, I spent the entire summer in Beirut for the past 2 to 3 years, the entire winter in Beirut. So technically, 1/3 of my year is still in Beirut, and I do plan to complete my PhD in field work in Beirut, despite all the turbulences and the dangers that are really coming around. But there's always a way to get by. Um, Pittsburgh has been a very interesting experience because it's a very shy city.
Hmm.
That's not like New York. It's not like Chicago or Boston. Pittsburgh is a very modest city. No one is putting Pittsburgh in your face,
Mm.
except the sports teams,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
I don't interact with. But right, but generally speaking, normal human beings are not putting Pittsburgh in your face. So I find that interesting,
mm.
and I think Pittsburgh is um, an also emerging social movement experience for Palestine, because New York, we know it exists. You know, it's existed since the 80s. There has been both a Jewish, an Arab, and internationalist rise in pro-Palestine politics. Boston too. They were talking about the cities of Edward Said and Noam Chomsky, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They already have their experiments. Pittsburgh is always re-emerging as a place where this is possible, especially as a city with a very strong union organizing,
Hmm.
with a very strong land back organizing, with a very strong liberal sentiment too, right? So it has a lot of potential, a lot of potential, and the Pittsburgh encampment was one of the biggest encampments in the country.
Yeah,
So it really proved its potential, and I think as the city grows and as it expands, um, Palestine solidarity in Pittsburgh will also become increasingly more important. We had the Not on Our Dime campaign, in which we gathered with the first local experiment to put divesting from Israel on the referendum. Um, in Pittsburgh, and that gathered over 20,000 signatures. This was the first experiment in the entire country, and it emerged from Pittsburgh and will be exported to other cities. So there's a lot of innovation when you're a shy city,
yeah,
when
yeah.
you're already not crowded, right, with initiatives.
Yeah, I imagine I've not been, but I imagine Pittsburgh as an industrial kind of working class base and a trade union base, and kind of emerging from that in like you say in a modest but powerful way. So an interesting space to be in. And what next for you, Karim? What's how long have you got left on your PhD?
So I'm gonna be finishing in around 2 years, and my primary goal right now is going back to Lebanon. Uh, and finding a way to integrate both fieldwork and organizing commitments. My understanding of fieldwork is that I am already living a 10-year participant observation as someone who is constantly in touch with comrades and constantly in the recruitment processes and constantly introducing themselves to youth and people within sectoral politics and regional politics across localities in Lebanon. I mean, between 2019 and 2024, I don't know if I've met less than 1,500 human beings with in-depth conversations. So the insights you get are enormous. But it's also quite difficult to be both an observer who's objective and someone who is also extremely entrenched in the process. But as a Michael Borroway fan, God rest his soul, he passed away in a bit. I'm very inspired by the idea of let's actually put aside the objectivism and go right inside. And let's see if going right inside gives us many more answers than being a distant observer. But maybe that requires also a very innovative time schedule that I have not been able to figure out.
Yeah, yeah, we should talk more about that because I mean, I left academia. I entered late in life. I didn't do university as a young person. I kind of went in my thirties and got very engaged in critical theory and kind of got educated later on and really interested in it. But I spent 10 years in academia and I left because I needed to be kind of more engaged. It was like I needed that kind of activism, that engagement in the world to kind of try and understand it. And it was, and a lot of my writings, I bring quite a lot of subjectivity into it. It's like, it's like it's almost like you have to, for me, you have to kind of, there is no objective neutrality anyway. So, we can pretend or we can kind of like, maybe for some hard sciences, it's more important. But when we're talking about leadership and activism and social movements, then your subjectivity is there anyway, and I think the best thing you can do is be transparent about it. Like acknowledge where you're coming from, acknowledge your journey, acknowledge kind of where you're from, and then speaking from that place. I think it's much more powerful than trying to pretend to have a neutral kind of lens.
Oh, definitely. I mean, definitely, and I think there's a lot to learn. Of course, there are benefits to distance, right? And to be honest, the distance that I got when I became a PhD student, I think amplified um, my mental health, even though I have never really experimented with therapy, but you just notice that it amplifies it because you stop being so exposed to so many human beings,
Yeah.
right? You get that slight isolation you well need, um, but at the same time, so it has its fruits. Its psychological fruits, its methodological fruits, its theoretical fruits. But at the same time, I think when you're part and parcel of the field, there is a dimension that is regularly neglected and ignored by those who are professional scholars.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
but it should be done in collaboration with them, right? The organizers cannot pretend to know all. You do need the traditional scholarship. You do need an outer lens, and you do need to be part of academia's bureaucratic structure to expand some of your scope beyond your subjectivity. So I do think the organizers have to be modest as well as the academics, and they have to find a way to talk to one another. And I think that's also the case with intellectuals and organizers, right? Writers and organizers, uh, particularly when organizers are trying to be entrepreneurs
Mm.
and writers are attempting to be critics. And those don't go hand in hand because entrepreneurs can be dictators, right? They can
Yeah.
transform to be something that critics don't like, or they
Mm.
have the potential to. And so how do you create intellectuals and entrepreneurs that have healthy discussion with one another? That needs a different discussion on the human condition.
Yeah, it does. I mean, my deep dive into a PhD was like formative for me, and it's like only afterwards you look back on it and try and understand what happened. And part of it is just the resilience it gives you to kind of work through such a huge amount of data. Like, you try to hold so much data, and at times you think you feel kind of overwhelmed by it, and you're never going to get any sense from it. And yeah, and just the amount of stuff. But I mean, it really made me think a lot about the role of the intellectual, because I live in a world which is quite a dumbed down world, to be honest. Like the world of organizational consulting and coaching, it's a kind of almost like an anti-intellectual kind of world. It's like people use ideas like democracy to say we don't need intellectuals anymore. And I guess this is going back to Said, and he kind of wrote that famous piece on the role of an intellectual. And tell me what you think the role of the intellectual is at the moment.
So my problem with intellectuals is that, and I've been writing a bit on this. I think I think intellectualism, particularly from the secular leftist humanist umbrella, which includes a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
That's a very, very wide umbrella. I think there are several problems. Number one is they seem to enjoy the margin, right? They seem to enjoy being an elite that speaks to elites.
Yes.
And I think it's comfortable. It's very comfortable to speak a language that other people recognize and you have these interactions with them. But you end up not being able to develop a popular charisma. And popular charisma, I think, is different than a character trait. It's the propensity to speak to a wide range of people and training yourself to dumber down the language that allows you to create a real popularizing and mainstream discourse revolving around your principles, right? I
Yeah,
think that's the challenge.
yeah,
Number two, I think they're very wary about being moralistic
mm,
and less wary about what they can accomplish, right? So sometimes they want to be right, but it's not enough to be right.
yeah,
What can you do with your words and your sentiments and your lexicon and your glossary? What can you accomplish? I think is equally as important.
mm,
And it's really not easy to transform into that type of person. You need to be involved in organizing circles and you have to empathize with their challenges to better understand the very limits that people have when
yeah,
challenged powerful regimes. I think those are some two challenges that I found very important.
yeah. No, I'd agree with both, and it's interesting. The second one is kind of there's a tension between finding a popular language or a way of speaking to a populace without dumbing down and without kind of selling out, holding it. I think quite often people underestimate the capacity for the masses to understand ideas. Like if you speak to their condition, if you speak to people's conditions where they are, then they have a much greater chance of understanding it. And you don't have to do that in great intellectual ways. But if you're trying to sell an idea to somebody which doesn't speak to their condition, doesn't speak to where they are, then that's where the barriers. You hit barriers, I think, and I think it's kind of trying to understand where people are, like you say, to empathise with people, to be close to people, to understand where they are. Then I think you have a greater chance of communicating with them. Sure.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely. And I think the problem is that intellectuals and organizers have different tools of practice, right? Intellectuals also have a different audience from which they seek approval.
Mm,
Same for organizers. They have different metrics in which they evaluate their own personal success.
yeah.
And I think that's also part of the problem, that they're part of different institutions and hierarchies and organizational structures, right? Intellectuals are part of newspapers. They're part of digital websites. They're part of social media circuits, increasingly so, of course. They're part of podcast commentators. There are a wide range of bubbles with which intellectuals communicate with the world. Organizers have the street, have the meeting room. They do have elements of social media, but it takes place in a different way. They're very consumed by internal feuds. They have expectations laid out by other organizers. It's very hard to put these two together constantly because people's attention span is very limited and their capacity to endure is also very limited. I think that's primarily the problem. And it's hard to get someone in a room and tell them where they could be wrong because they don't even have much time to talk. So I think that's also a big challenge.
And does your PhD and your thinking on the political worker try and bridge some of that? Because for me, this is like where the action is. It's like not either or. It is trying to finding the transitional points and then the nodal points where change can happen from the kind of the intellectual ideas and the organizing kind of activists.
So yes, because political workers can be both the intellectuals and the organizer.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
intellectuals produce political work, they produce intellectual work.
Mm,
Organizers produce protest work, electoral work, organizational setup work, logistical work, um, statement writing work, cultural work, discussion work. And you need intellectuals to advance parts of that, right? So it makes so much sense for these two components to constantly speak to one another, and in many cases they do, but also in many other cases they don't. And what ends up happening, I think, is a tragedy of organizing work, especially within secular, humanist, liberal, leftist circles. I do believe it exists in the conservative sphere too, the more right wing sphere, the more identitarian, reactionary sphere. But within our sphere, it has been very severe because, you know, I think it's also because academia has been very friendly to the progressive left in all in large, right? There are lots of exceptions, lots of exceptions, but generally speaking,
Yeah.
academia has been a home for the wider family of the progressive left,
Hmm.
especially if you look at the demographics of professors in the past 3 decades and faculty members and whatnot. So then it ends up becoming their only home, and
Yeah.
especially if it
Yeah.
overconsumes them. And I think
Mm.
that's a big problem.
That's very interesting. Karim, it's been really interesting talking to you. I like to end the podcast with a couple of questions. I ask guests from their lived experience, what does it mean to live a good life? And what does it mean to create a good society? Big questions.
I think a good life is where you're able to constantly create, but also be content with very small and limited resources.
Hmm.
I think finding that is really important. And I think organizers who are constantly depressed until they grab power, that ends up becoming another Stalin or Lenin. But you shouldn't be depressed until you grab power. You should enjoy other things, the very simple things that ordinary human beings do. And I think organizers don't tend to do that a lot. A good society really is one where people can talk to one another, I think is really important. And I think that's increasingly less common. I think people have trouble and anxiety speaking to the other. And I think people have limited their capacity to be externalized agents and have become very comfortable with their echo chambers. So I think that's very troublesome. And dissent, allowing dissent to flourish, but also teaching people to become practical practitioners and entrepreneurs within the craft of state building, and really democratizing that process and learning so that human beings can learn how to deal with power very practically. I think the more it's democratized, the more you have many Lenins and not a few Lenins, is the only way you can have no Stalins. Because that way they contest one another in a framework that is less violent.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Karim, it's been really delightful talking with you. I'm wishing you a very interesting future. Keep up the work towards a peaceful Lebanon and a peaceful Middle East. And thanks for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much for hosting me, and have a wonderful day. I really enjoyed this.
And just to say to the listeners, we've been talking about coaching. We are actually running a critical coaching program starting in September. It's a diploma, accredited. If you're interested, get in touch with the Eco Leadership Institute. Thanks for listening.